Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Boulder on February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, 2022. Hello, my name is Sharon Ballou, and I'm very happy to be your worship leader for today's service. We welcome all at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Boulder. All of you are welcome, all of you are sacred. Whatever your past was like, whatever the present moment is like for you, we invite you to journey into the future together. And welcome all of you who are joining us by the magic of the internet. The chat box will be open if you need to get a message to us. If you are a new online visitor, please email our office administrator, Amy Sven, and tell us how you found us. You will find her email listed in the Zoom chat. Our church website also has a great deal of information about UUCB, our programs, and our activities. I have a couple of announcements about activities and programs that are coming up soon. Let me see if I can locate them. Yes. 2 announcements about upcoming gatherings and groups. Follow the link in the chat now to sign up. Tuesday evenings, join Reverend David and UUCB member and therapist Francesca Bini for a 6-week small group focused on naming, holding, honoring, and transforming grief and trauma. Sign up for Soul Matters Covenant groups also this week. New groups are forming now. They meet twice monthly, focusing on a different theme each month using materials which include readings and media, as well as thought-provoking questions. You'll find that sign-up sheet also in the Zoom. Okay. Now, please ensure that your microphones remain muted as you join with others in this morning's worship service.
Friends, let me add to those announcements before kickoff this afternoon. Come by church at 1 o'clock this afternoon. We're going to celebrate Amy Zen as she heads on from us to her new role with the Unitarian Universalist Association. We're delighted for her and sad to see her go, and there's a lot of carrot cake that needs eating. Next week, I'm really happy to say, and unexpectedly moved to, next week we'll return to in-person services at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. The 9 a.m. service is going to be a little bit different. We're going to meet in the Sky Room for a less formal service with lots and lots of singing all together. And then at 11 o'clock, this service, our regular service, will be live streamed here from the Earth Room. There's plenty of space if you'd like to come in person. No sign-up needed, just come on. We require folks to be vaccinated and masked in the building. And of course, we will continue this live stream onwards into the future. We're not going back to being an in-person church. We're going forward to be a multi-platform, multi-channel church. Having said all of that, and on a day filled with music and excitement, the theme for our service today is silence. And finding the still silence even in the midst of all the noise and the chaos. The educator Rita Weathersby observes that silence as a spiritual practice, whether it's meditation, reflection, or prayer, challenges the busyness of our lives in a fundamental way. In a rational, materialistic, workaholic culture, most of us, high achievers especially, are oppressed by time. We pressure ourselves internally Even if we're not pressured externally, we use time, manage time, spend time, save time. We have this hurry sickness engendered by fast-paced lives. And not surprisingly, we remain largely unaware of the enormous cost to our individual and collective psyches by not dwelling in silence. Like the frog in the slow boiling pot of water, this overwork is a kind of violence, a psychic violence against ourselves that keeps us fragmented and keeps us from the silence that lets those pieces come back together again. Let's do a demonstration. I want to show you what is going on inside your head when you sit down to pray or to meditate. So in order to demonstrate this, I've got a bunch of dirt and rocks and leaves and a few twigs, and I'm going to pour this big pitcher of water in here to make a swirling, dirty mess. All right, not that I'm meaning to say you have a dirty mind in particular, but that what happens inside of our heads is like this. It's a swirl and a stew, and everything's mixed together, and you can't see very clearly. This is sometimes what my mind is like, full of thoughts and hopes and anxieties, and it's muddy and busy. And what meditation does is to quiet down that swirl, being still, breathing, being in silence together. It calms this down. It lets the mud, it lets the silt settle out until it's in its place at the bottom and there's clear water on top of it. It may seem sometimes like it's never going to clear. But through the course of this time together, hopefully, presumably, it will. Let's try it together just for a moment here. Let me invite you into silence, into prayer and meditation earlier in our service than we usually do. Invite you to breathe deep the breath of life, to be where you are, to let your feet rest squarely on the floor, your hands in your lap supported, your head pulled upwards, making a stack of the bones of your spine, grounded, pressing down against the floor, against your chair, your couch, and pushing upwards. And each time you breathe, each breath that comes in and back out again adds just a little more stillness to the morning. With each breath that you let out, it's like the suspended little bits of mud and dirt in the waters of your mind settle just a little more. Your breath steady in and out, like the pull of gravity, subtle and present, that slows you so that the chatter, the self-talk, the running lists that live inside your head, they get set down. And bit by bit, breath by breath, clarity emerges. It doesn't happen all at once, but in time, bit by bit, even if it's not intention, silence and breath will do this. Will you join me for 7 slow breaths in silence as the mud settles inside all of us? Thank you, friends, for finding that stillness together. I think, slowly and by millimeters, the top starting to be a little bit more clear.
If you are joining us online and you have a candle or a chalice near your computer, please get ready to light it. We invite you to type into the chat box where your chalice is lit, the street or the neighborhood or the city if you're joining us from outside Boulder County. I'd like to invite John Cuddington to light this morning's chalice.
Okay, good morning, UUCBers, far and wide, and also the AV team who is right here at the back at UUCB. Today we are here to celebrate and bemoan the departure of Amy Zen, our office administrator. The monthly theme for the chalice lighting is Widening the Circle, and the rock group Three Dog Night had 21 top hits, 21 of them between 1969 and the mid-70s. My challenge for the chalice lighting is to link A, B, and C. So, point A. Amy Zen joined us as office admin guru in August of 2018. She implemented many important changes to our online computer system, getting us familiar with using Google Docs, publishing the midweek messenger, scheduling meetings, moving us to a keyed access system for our building, helping to manage the COVID pandemic, etc., etc., etc. Amy notes the most challenging part of her job and also the most rewarding was watching Ingrid in her fight for our own rights and the rights of others in our awful immigration system. She's a very special woman and a wonderful mother. It broke my heart to see the system ignore and abuse her, and her stay of removal was hard-won and much deserved. She goes on, the most interesting part of the job was learning about all of the members. Everyone has such interesting stories and experiences to share. Point B, throughout Amy's time, she was repeatedly widening her circle as she rose to take on all the tasks that I mentioned above and so many more. I'm sure she helped to widen our circles too. As Amy moves on to new transitions, as her role as transitions administrator at the UUA, she'll have many further opportunities to widen her circle. I don't have the time or the talent to go into these, but rest assured we will gather in front of UUCB at 1 o'clock today to celebrate with Amy and eat cake. Let them eat cake, Marie Antoinette once said. It's time to, more than just a little, but mostly time to celebrate Amy Zen's wonderful time with us. Point C. Today I'm going to light our chalice with a slight bang to get it going.
Celebrate, celebrate, dance to the music.
Oh, you can hardly hear my music.
Celebrate, dance to the music. Celebrate, celebrate,
Dance to the music. Celebrate, celebrate, dance to the music. Thanks very much. I hope to see you all at 1 o'clock.
We now invite all of those gathered in your various locations to join together in fellowship and community as we say aloud together our congregation's covenant. We gather in fellowship to speak truth to each other, to reach out and touch one another, to care with each other, and to seek the truth divine. So be it.
Friends, I invite you again into stillness, into the quiet of prayer and meditation. Remembering there's a place for exuberance and celebration and a place for quiet, often back to back. Our words for meditation are by the poet Pablo Neruda, Acalarse, keeping quiet. Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still for once on the face of the earth. Let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for a second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines, and we would be all together in such sudden stillness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fires, victories with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it's about. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving and for once could do nothing. Perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I'll go. We'll be together in silence for a few moments. Resting in silence, our hope or prayer or intention is not to run from the world. Wrapping ourselves in stillness is not a denial of the things that need doing, nor is the silence mere preparation, gathering our energies for everything that has to be done, waiting for us outside this space. Our silence is active. It's a listening. It's a quality of paying attention within and beyond ourselves. And our hope and our prayer and intention this morning is in the stillness to find the connection, the wholeness, the richness and texture of our lives that we sometimes forget to listen for. Amen. In that spirit, each time we gather, we share with each other the joys and the sorrows, the hopes and the fears that we carry with us. We trust these little pieces of our lives into each other's hands, that we don't try to make it through this world alone. And so as the music begins in just a moment, you're invited to share those joys or sorrows here in the Zoom chat. I invite you to share as you feel moved.
Find the stillness, hold the stillness.
are mourning. In particular, this week, Sandy Skull passed. We remember her life and mourn her death. For peace in the world, too. The volatility that makes it uncertain what will happen in Ukraine. And for all those caring for people who are suffering. Thank you for the ways that you bless each other. In just a moment, we'll share a reflection on silence from the composer John Cage. Cage was an avant-garde composer, tried to push the limits of what music was and could be and why. His most famous work was called 433. Seated at the piano, or whatever instrument they play, the musician sits still, takes up their hands above the keyboard or the bow above the strings, but makes no music, and instead remains still and silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But the performance is not a joke or a trick, nor is it a performance of 4.5 minutes of silence. The performance is 4.5 minutes of the sound of the room, bodies and breath, the creak of a shifting chair or a turning page, the hum of the furnace or the lights. It is bringing attention to a silence bursting with sound. Here's John Cage on the fullness of silence.
When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking, and talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear traffic, the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue, for instance, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting. And I love the activity of sound. What it does is it gets louder and quieter, and it gets higher and lower, and it gets longer and shorter. It does all those things which I'm completely satisfied with that. I don't need sound to talk to me. We don't see much difference between time and space. We don't know where one begins and the other stops. So that most of the arts we think of as being in time, and most of the arts we think of as being in space. Marcel Duchamp, for instance, began thinking of thinking of music as being not a time art, but a space art. And he made it a piece called Sculpture Musicale, which means different sounds coming from different places and lasting, producing a sculpture which is sonorous and which remains. People expect listening to be more than listening. And so sometimes they speak of inner listening, or the meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer. And they say, these people who understand that finally say, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are. And I have no need for them to be anything more than what they are. I don't want them to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's a bucket, or that it's a president, or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound. And I'm not so stupid either. There was a German philosopher who's very well known, Immanuel Kant, and he said there are two things that don't have to mean anything. One is music, and the other is laughter. Don't have to mean anything, that is, in order to give us very deep pleasure. Oh, you know that, don't you? The sound experience, which I prefer to all others, is the experience of silence. And the silence almost everywhere in the world now is traffic. If you listen to Beethoven or to Mozart, you see that they're always the same. But if you listen to traffic, you see it's always different.
The Hoh Rainforest at Olympic National Park, north and west of Seattle, contains the quietest square inch of the United States. The quietest place in the country. It's a green place. Lush, mossy trees, mossy rocks, mossy ground. Sitka spruce, western hemlock trees grow 300 feet tall. They move in slow circles at the top while the wind pushes them. There are massive feathery lichens and a rich brown soil, pine cones and needles, rotting leaves, and bright fungus, and enormous 9-inch long banana slugs. Elk graze. Cougar and bobcat hunt quietly. Tree frogs call. Raccoons ramble around doing whatever raccoons do when they're not in your garbage. And at the center of it, there in the middle, is the quietest place in the country. Not silent, but free from the intrusions of human sounds. Not the remotest place in the country, but the farthest on the balance from roads and homes and flight paths. Gordon Hempton is the man who mapped this quietest place. And he's made what he calls acoustic ecology his life's work. He explains why he does this. He says, I grew up thinking that I was a listener. Except on my way to graduate school one time, I simply pulled over, making the long drive from Seattle, Washington to Madison, Wisconsin, pulled over in a field to get some rest, and a thunderstorm rolled over me. When I lay there, and the thunder echoed through the valley, and I could hear the crickets, I just simply took it all in. And that's then that I realized I had the whole wrong impression of what it means to actually listen. I thought that listening meant focusing my attention on what was important even before I had heard it, and screening out everything that was unimportant before I had heard it. In other words, he says, I had been paying a lot of attention to people, but I really hadn't been paying a lot of attention to what is all around me. It was on that day that I really discovered what it means to be alive as another animal in a natural place. That changed my life. I had one question, and that was, how? How could I be 27 years old and never have really listened before? imagine yourself in a place like that. A place where there is no hum of things made by humans, no clatter of the garbage truck, no bass rumble of airplanes, but only you, another animal in an ecosystem. When nothing is pressing in on you, what do you hear? What do you think about? Where does your mind go? What takes your attention? What do you hear in the silence of yourself? It's one of the same essential tasks we undertake in spiritual practice. When the swirl of our mind stops swirling and slowly begins to clear bit by bit. It's making progress over there. When the swirl of our mind starts to clear, what's left? What do you hear in that silence? I'm not asking for a theological proposition about who do you hear. I'm not asking for a psychological analysis of what are the mental processes at work. I'm saying, I'm inviting you just to listen. Listen for what's there before you filter out what should and shouldn't be there. Listen for what's there in the silence before choosing the things that you really ought to be paying attention to in that silence. Hear all of it. When the swirl of our mind stops swirling, what do we hear? John Cage reminds that in the silence, it isn't necessarily a voice or a meaning clear and definite that speaks to you, but that resting in the noise of the world is enough. In the silence, what do you hear? What is that still, small voice that speaks? And how does it speak? With words or memories or feelings in the silence? Do you feel it welling up from within you, or do you hear it coming to you from outside? What do you experience in the silence? Hempton says, who mapped the quietest place on earth, he says, often the biggest challenge for adults when it comes to silence is that we're so busy being somewhere else that when we're in a silent place and there are no distractions, we finally get to meet ourselves, and that can be frightening. This is a part of the work of deep listening that we practice in this community. In the Soul Matters Covenant groups, in the grief group, invited at the start of the service, the work is to share honestly and authentically and vulnerably, but even more so, it is to listen deeply to each other without fixing, without advising, without setting each other straight, but to be wholly present in the moment, in this spiritual practice of empathy, the work of identifying with another, no matter how different their circumstances might be, tending to our interconnections with one another as people, and silencing all those inward voices, silencing all the outside noise, finding that still center within yourself to wholly listen to another, work which is whole and holy. That deep work of listening is not only to meet another, though, it's to meet ourselves as well. The listening is for everything that happens in the silence, all the textures of our own lives. We're paying attention to life as it is. We're removing from the way we move through the world. We're taking away the lenses and the schema that organize everything neatly into categories, things that we care for or don't. The Quaker William Penn says, true silence is the rest of the mind. True silence is the rest of the mind. It is to the spirit what sleep is to the body, nourishment and refreshment. I appreciate that because I feel so often that silence is the absence. It's the miss of something that could be getting done, but instead is just the nothing of silence. Silence is to the spirit what sleep is to the body, nourishment and refreshment. I talk sometimes with newcomers to this community that the worship service, what we're doing, what you're doing right now in this moment, is spiritual practice. And that if a person's not used to that, you have to learn how to do a Sunday service. Nobody automatically gets something out of this experience. You're all working just as hard as me. And this silence is a piece of it. You listen on a Sunday morning, not just to the words and the notes coming through the audio feed. You listen also to the silence of your own self. You let the mud settle. Not so that what I have to say can reach you perfectly and tell you how everything is, but so that you can listen in the quiet that remains. You have the quiet and the space to hear what is. A time when the fragments of ourselves come back together again. I heard once the story of a person who decided to turn an ordinary Monday into a day of silence. It was an experiment, and they planned it as a one-time occurrence. And I commend this to you. Try this out sometime. It doesn't have to be Monday, but make a day of silence. A day of silence. No music, no phone, no radio, no speech. But for this person, it proved so transformative that they continued the practice of silent days for 2 decades. Total silence on the first and third Monday of each month. And said that by detaching from the bustle, detaching from this hectic lifestyle, by learning to listen to your deepest self, you find a center from which to live. And in practicing silence, she describes it as a secret garden, a cloistered, a sacred, a private place where true personal growth is possible. I will confess that a full day of silence intimidates me tremendously. Not to mention, full days of silence are complex if you have kids and work and pets and life, but the perfect need not be the enemy of the good in this or any practice. The secret gardens of silence in our lives, like any garden, can be an acre or a window box. The point is to slow down, to focus attention. And maybe that is a weekend retreat of silence. Maybe it's an hour before bed. Maybe it's 5 minutes in the parked car when you've reached your destination and before you need to go in. Maybe it's the commute to work or running errands, just turning off the car radio. Almost every one of the routine chores that I do, folding laundry and washing dishes and vacuuming, I do it with an earbud in, listening to music or a podcast, but maybe the habit is to try the task in silence and see what happens. Maybe after finishing a telephone conversation, sit quietly for a minute or two and just breathe. Or maybe take a long walk by yourself. The writer Megan O'Rourke speaks of her time in the Hoh rainforest and the beautiful and uncomfortable gifts of silence. She says, ours is a poetic dilemma. We want silence, but we also want to blot it out. We confuse silence for peace, and then go a little crazy when we have it, silence. We choose to live in noise through centuries of complaining about it. But adrift in noise, we can duck confrontation with the metaphysical and the existential. the piercing, enduring regret, and how you treated an old, estranged friend. The iniquities evident on every corner of this city, the fear that your life has been a project of self-delusion. In silence, these things return, and we face them. But the truth is they're there all along, and only in silence do we pay attention to them at last. On a wild beach in that rainforest, O'Rourke writes, in the quiet, the transformation was a subtler one. She speaks of an inner rather than an outer shift. In quiet, it turns out we perceive more. Our senses spring to life. She says, I noticed two fallen trees whose root systems were intertwined. So entangled it would be impossible to separate them without damaging them. Instead of revving like an engine trying to drive ever onward, my mind slowed, slinked sideways and inward. What announced themselves on that beach, in the existential silence of old rocks and old oceans, were memories. She says they were memories of my mother who died almost 10 years ago, and the deep sorrow of her never knowing my son, and all that he would lose by not knowing her. These thoughts, says O'Rourke, these thoughts were like music. Rather than my having them, they were having me. And I climbed atop a pile of beach logs, enormous spruces 50 feet long, piled up like matchsticks by the roaring ocean, and let the driftwood warm my feet, and the silence pool in my ears. Will you join me in a moment of silence? In the silence of a moment or an hour or a day, may we find ourselves again at last, and let the driftwood warm our feet and the silence pool in our ears. Amen.
Laughter I'm reaching toward the sky above me. I'm moving with the earth's own rhythm. I'm listening for the voice within me. I'm following the sound of laughter. I'm reaching toward the sky above me. The earth is calling, follow the sound unbound below me. Follow the sound unbound above me. Follow the sound unbound above me, around me. I'm moving with the earth's own rhythm. I'm listening for the voice within me. I'm following the sound of laughter. I'm reaching toward the sky above me. I'm moving with the earth's own rhythm. I'm listening for the voice within me. I'm following the sound of laughter. I'm reaching toward the sky above me.
This month, our offering goes to SPAN, Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence. Today, we have a 3-minute video to show you what goes on at SPAN.
Comments started coming in that I could lose more weight, I could be better in bed, I could make better meals, I could be better, and I kind of believed that for a while and tried. He made me feel like it was my fault, that I didn't do enough as a parent, a mother, a woman, and so it was my fault.
Gaslighting is a term that explains this phenomenon a lot of survivors experience, basically being told that the abuse that they know is happening in their lives isn't actually happening. It's why it's so important for us to believe survivors. They're the experts of their own lives, of the strengths that they hold and carry. They're the experts of the abuse that they experience, whether it's physical, psychological, emotional.
I was deep in shame about that, which shame is one of those things that kept me from being connected to the people I loved and that loved me and that cared about me, that could help me understand.
Someone who is experiencing abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, it's real and it has a lasting impact. There doesn't need to be the existence of scars for us to know that someone is exerting power and control to make your life smaller.
I didn't have to wait to be raped. I didn't have to wait to be broken with bones and blood. I already felt like that in the inside, and part of me wanted to look like that on the outside because it was so hard to live in shame by myself.
So we know the majority of survivors are experiencing psychological and emotional abuse, and oftentimes that's intentional, right? You can see that an abuser may not want to leave marks, and that's just another experience that exacerbates gaslighting.
SPAN was the right choice because I got to see who I was. I got to see what the trauma was, I got to see what abuser was in my life, and I got to see who I was. And that I had a really able body that would tell me when things weren't all right. And so I finally got to start listening to it. Coming out of the darkness and having people hold your hand. Like, I've never met another organization that made a community quite like that for people that were so vulnerable like I was and in so much need like I was.
Please be as generous as you can. You can make a donation now using the link posted in the chat by sending a check to UCB or scanning the QR code on the next slide with your mobile phone.
Our experiment has not resulted in perfectly clear water. Above an even layer of the mud that has settled to the bottom. And that, I think, is an even better and more accurate analogy for how it is with us, too. It's progress bit by bit, and something comes along to stir it back up again inside each of us. And then, slowly again, we let it settle. In this week and in this bright world, may you find the moments of silence that let you settle, no matter how much you get stirred back up again. Go in peace, and amen.